And now it is my pleasure to formally introduce Eric Grossman. Eric will be speaking to us on the topic, Why I Had to Leave Academia. Eric, welcome. We look forward to this.
Thank you, Jane.
You're welcome.
And thank you again for having me back. In case you don't know, I haven't been around each time. This has actually become an annual tradition. Eric delivers the bad news, you know, whatever that year's bad news is. I mean, I can't help though to note and feel kind of the warmth and welcoming of your congregation. It's always kind of reassuring. It does make me wonder why I don't join the rest of the year, but even it being kind of once a year, I really do appreciate it. I don't know, take a moment here to express gratitude for other things. As I noted, I'm grateful for having known John Iskra. And like I say, I think maybe the best thing you could say about a person is they make you want to be better. And as I was commenting, his generosity really makes me want to be better. And I think it has slowly, you know, incrementally, I've tried to live up to that spirit of generosity and giving to others of our time and attention. And I think I'm doing a little better than I used to. I hope so. I think, like most all of us, I'm grateful to be watching the floods at least appear to recede from our 2-year pandemic. I've been thinking of it as a flood. You know, it's very disorienting, the way rising water just sort of pulls you up from your moorings and floats everything, and you can't, you know, sort of get your orientation based on land that you see. You sort of end up on a little island clinging, you know, by yourself. And I'm sort of gratefully watching, you know, the land bridges form as the water goes down. And I can see other people, you know, they look like they were on another island way over there, but now I'm noticing that we're actually connected. And it's very reassuring to me. I hope it is to you too. And I hope you're feeling the waters go down and some sense of groundedness again. I listened to just a little bit of last year's talk. I sounded terrible, man. And, you know, I commented that it was nice to see you guys. But this time it really is. And you know, we've kind of gotten a little more proficient with our video conferencing. So it's great, you know, to kind of have this set up. As was noted, you know, I can check in again with old friends, you know, original from Emory. Of course, Paul hired me. So it's great to see Paul and Nancy and Harry and I were talking beforehand because we were fast friends really from very early. And Jean, I met Jean, you know, almost as soon as I moved to Emory, maybe as soon, I don't know, it was very early on. In any case, oh, and Felicia, and then eventually her son, who, you know, we partnered up on several kind of adventures over the years. So it's I don't know, it's really great. And I feel like something like normalcy is returning. For me, you know, as I've said, I've had to leave higher ed. I'm actually still teaching 2 classes remotely right now, and I have never had more fun. I'm having a blast teaching. Sort of unfortunately, it's because I know that I'm leaving, that I'm able to finally have fun. Now, why would that be? Well, I don't have to sort of self-censor in a way that has become an issue, not just for me, but sort of really globally, sort of a culture of inability to speak what we're feeling in our hearts and thinking with our minds, and to be open about that without fear of what might happen as a result of being honest. So I don't know. So I'm enjoying it. And I feel good where I'm headed. I'm going to lay out the case for you. You may not like it, but that's the fun part, right? Is I can go ahead and say it now. I don't have to worry about keeping my job. All right, so let's go back to deep philosophical questions. How do we know what's true? I've always loved that question. How do we know what's true? Good Lord, has the pandemic not caused us to ask that question more persistently than ever, in human history? How do we know what's true? I've kind of distilled down my technical answer. Obviously I could write a book about that. I mean, a book could be written about that. I don't know if it's obvious I could do it. But let me distill my answer down to one sentence. Getting to the truth requires we coordinate the most agreement possible between people who are so disposed to actually seek it. And there is such a process, by the way, and that process is science. That's what scientists do. In good faith, try to come to an agreement about what's true. That's why I was attracted to science. Took science, loved science in high school, took science in college, taught science in high school, and then came to Emory and Henry to prepare science teachers. Okay. Now, the thing is, it hasn't really worked out more recently. Something has thrown a wrench into that process. And I think you've probably noticed that. But if you're a fish, it's hard to tell that you're swimming in the water. But standing outside of it, I can kind of scoop up some samples and try to show you that it's wet. So again, this is just like, holding your hand up, in the autumn when the leaves are coming down. It's very easy for one to fall in. So I just poked around. So here's something from yesterday. Notable theoretical physicist Sabine Hossenfelder. She studies quantum gravity. She posted to Twitter yesterday. I wrote a research proposal about inflation in the early universe, not in your supermarket, and it bounced back because I didn't explain its relevance to sex, gender, and diversity. I need to add a paragraph on this. Last week, February 15th, Inside Higher Ed published a piece called Much More Than Bones. I don't know if anybody follows Inside Higher Ed, but this was a story about Elizabeth Weiss. She's a professor of physical anthropology at San Jose State University. She wrote a book called Repatriation and Erasing the Past. She's been sort of recently embroiled in this controversy because she has challenged laws that require reburial of paleo fossils like bones. And in her book, one of the things she said is the best, most accurate story does not depend on who's telling it. It depends on the quality of the research. And as a scientist, I'm inclined to agree. But in response to her thesis, a group of scholars got together and wrote an open letter to be posted to social media saying Weiss's book stands in stark contrast with contemporary anthropological practice, scorning decades of complex navigations to repair and revitalize relationships between bioarchaeologists and traditionally oppressed people. Now I'm going to come back to that story because I think it's quite interesting and because that's something I studied in college was biological anthropology. But let me back up a little bit because this goes back. I think it's accelerated quite a bit in the last few years, but the seeds were very apparent to me even as a naive 18-year-old when I went off to study at Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Now, what was the first life lesson I learned? It wasn't from my professors. It was from the cosmopolitan peers that I acquired, also coming to Brown. And one of the first things they did was make fun of my tastes in music, which were derived from, the top 40 radio that I played as a kid, as many of us did. So what was the problem? Well, little did I know that my musical tastes, had been determined, engineered, in fact, by sort of corporate media interests. And this had to be pointed out to me by my peers. It's like, Eric, wake up. There's all kinds of independent music out there and you can form your own tastes. You don't have to let your mind be shaped by these outside forces. So what does that have to do with why I can't say certain things as an academic? Well, I want you to see that there are forces far more vast than that are engineering our tastes and what we think is acceptable to say and think right now. Now, what do we call this? What's this phenomenon? It goes by a lot of names, that it hasn't settled into one thing yet. I follow one person named John McWhorter. You might have heard of him. He's a outspoken linguist at Columbia University. He's written a book called Woke Racism. He describes this force as one exerted by a vocal minority that he calls the elect. And what he says most succinctly is, we are watching the birth of a new religion, a new religion. I'm thinking about just calling it the new faith for the purposes of today, the new faith. Now, you could find descriptions of this. I could kind of cobble together my description, but I found a very, I don't know, apt, cogent, right-sized description. It's by N.S. Lyons. N.S. Lyons publishes on Substack, sort of an alternative media source, independent authors. And N.S. Lyons has a, I guess you would call it a Substack called Upheaval, and writes this: a new belief system characterizing all of existence as divisible into a Manichaean struggle for power between the oppressed and their oppressors has emerged and turned itself into a mass movement that is scrambling every aspect of traditional American political, cultural, religious, and even corporate life. But this ideology seemed to emerge so suddenly and is in its stark irrationality so alien to the modern liberal mind that surprised observers and hapless opponents so far struggle even to settle on a name for it. Cancel culture, identity politics, social justice, wokeness, postmodernism, reified postmodernism, neo-Marxism, cultural racism, just plain Marxism in a new guise, the successor ideology, the cult of the elect, or simply the new faith, whatever its name. What's clear by this point is that this all-consuming belief system is exceptionally zealous, insatiably revolutionary, self-righteously brutal, and going ideologically viral with breathtaking speed and essentially no opposition. The result is that the new faith, which rejects nearly every fundamental principle of liberal modernity, the existence of objective and immutable reality that can be discovered by reason, the scientific method, an enduring human nature, the primacy of the sovereign individual over the collective, impartial equality before the law, secular pluralism and the value of freedom of speech, the separation of the private and political spheres, is enthusiastically taking an axe to the decaying pillars holding up liberal democratic civilization. Whew. So as I said, this didn't come out of nowhere. I had observed seeds of this new faith at Brown University as early as the 1980s. So let me put you back in that time. Okay, I've given up pre-med, which my mom sent me there for. I've just decided to, go through the catalog and just take interesting sounding courses. My goal was something like, how can I figure out what's going on with human beings? Something like that. So one of the things I landed on was a seminar called a seminar in human biology. I did not know anything about the professor. We didn't have, whatever, rate my professor back then. Her name was Anne Fausto Sterling. I didn't know she'd just written a book called Myths of Gender and will go on to become a renowned sexologist. I didn't know this course was a more like a semester-long indoctrination into gender ideology. It really felt like an initiation. All the students took turns. It sort of felt like presenting to the guru. Now, I was able to say what I thought was true. It wasn't like that. I wasn't pretending. But, when I did my thing, like, oh, yeah, biology is what explains human sexuality. I tried to explain to the class, but they kind of politely nodded. And then we just moved on to the next thing. So more typical, because I was taking science courses, that was an unusual science courses. More typical was a class in animal behavior that I took with entomologist John Waggy. So I was struck at a lecture probably about, reproductive behavior, about some of the parallels between what he was describing with damselflies and, human sexuality. So I went up to him and I said, hey, that sounds a lot like human sexuality. What parallels could we draw between what you're describing and humans? And he literally yelled at me, absolutely nothing, and then turned to the next student. Now, I was a kid. That was scary. This was somebody I put up on a pedestal. And he essentially just slammed a wall between what he would call his field work and lab work and science and this sort of human domain. And I think that's a fairly typical response for a scientist who sees this thing coming. But I also had another professor who became sort of a mentor, and he was a biological anthropologist. Okay, he literally had to kind of try to understand human behavior with biology. His name is Stephen McGarvey. And I noticed he's still there and teaching. So he had a concern. He's also an epidemiologist, and he had a concern that I could tell. I mean, he hinted at it. He had this concern about relative reproductive rates in different populations and about global poverty. And he saw a relationship there. And I tried to ask, what's going on there? And he would sidestep it, with like, oh, that's a good question, Eric. I would love to be able to talk about that. And then he would sort of nod and wink and just go on to something else. So he kind of operated on this, implicit level, let's say, tacit level. And I think maybe those are the survivors, those people who have done that, who've been willing to kind of contort themselves into different levels of, let's say, honesty or something like that, literalness of dealing with the truth. But I think what I could derive from my experience, essentially 30 years ago, was that in the face of a budding faith, a takeover essentially by a new religion, the solutions for somebody in the academy are to surrender, right? Like the initiates in the gender ideology class, just learn to say those things that the guru would like. You could put a strong barrier, you imagine, that will hold out, the encroachment, as my biology professor tried. I don't think that's working. You can, like McGarvey, you can kind of try to operate at multiple levels of literalness or something like that. Or you can leave. I think those are your four options. And you know which one I've taken. And it might be tempting to think, well, that's just unusual. It's too bad you felt that way. Well, it's not unusual. And this is not hard. You could put, like I say, you could put the cup out and take a dip. This is all recent. So the president of St. John's recently wrote, I left my post as president of St. John's College in Annapolis to build a university in Austin dedicated to the fearless pursuit of truth. He published his rationale that included these stats. 62% of sampled college students agree that the climate on their campus prevents students from saying what they believe. 62%, 2/3. 70% of students favor reporting professors if the professor says something students find offensive. 491 disinvitation campaigns have occurred since 2000. About half of them have been successful. In other words, students who did not want a particular invited guest coming to campus, raising a fuss, and then the person is disinvited. Jody Shaw published her resignation from Smith College, saying, I was expected to participate in racially prejudicial behavior as a continued condition of employment. My supervisor named preferred racial quotas for job openings in our department. I was given supplemental literature in which the world's population was reduced to two categories: dominant group members and subordinated group members, based solely on characteristics such as race. Hired facilitators told everyone present that a white person's discomfort was a sign of their white fragility. The white person may act like they are in distress, but that's a power play. In other words, because I'm white, my discomfort was framed as aggression. I was shamed and humiliated in front of my colleagues. I was told there are legitimate reasons for asking employees to consider race in order to achieve social justice objectives. Portland State, Peter Boghossian recently published a letter to the provost, Susan Jeffords. I'm writing to resign as assistant professor of philosophy at Portland State. The university has made intellectual exploration impossible. It has transformed a bastion of free inquiry into a social justice factory whose only inputs are race, gender, victimhood, and whose only outputs are grievance and division. From American University. Again, this is last week, published in Quillette, an independent online magazine. Going by a pseudonym, Keith David, so I don't know. This person is worried about putting their name out there. He wrote that a colleague was getting out of academia because he'd concluded it's not possible for a white male to get a tenure track position in that field. And you know, what concerns me really more than anything is that it's hard for you to know what's going on because most people just won't say anything. The culture is that you're worried about being branded something online like a racist or transphobe. So there's a massive chilling effect, and it's just hard. That part's harder for me to sample, but again, posting under this pseudonym, Keith says, I'd seen plenty of searches in which members of the hiring committee went out of their way to hire persons of color or members of underrepresented groups, but nobody would admit publicly what was going on. Support for affirmative action is universal among academics. Few are willing to even express a hesitation or second thought, lest they be deemed racist. And going back to Peter Boghossian's letter at Portland State, students are being trained to mimic the moral certainty of ideologues. Faculty and administrators have abdicated the university's truth-seeking mission and instead drive intolerance of divergent beliefs and opinions. This has created a culture of offense where students are afraid to speak openly and honestly. The more I spoke about these issues, the more retaliation I face, he says. A former student complained and the university initiated a Title IX investigation. The investigator told me that in the future, I was not allowed to render my opinion about protected classes or teach in a way that my opinion about such classes could be known. Universities enforce ideological conformity through the threat of these investigations. So, I don't know, the pandemic for a lot of us, I think, again, floated us up where while disoriented, there's also the potential for moving in different directions. And so it has been a time to reconsider what we're doing and to, look for new landmarks to orient us. And I don't think what I'm doing is the only choice by any stretch. Elizabeth Weiss, the person whose story I started with, who wrote the book about repatriating bones, she is suing her university, saying she's being retaliated against for her stance. She posted that her dean and department chair hosted a panel called What to Do When a Tenured Professor is Branded a Racist. And then she was suddenly removed as curator of the university's collection, a role that she had had for 17 years, and locked out of the research facility on which her entire career had been based. So it could be that legal remedies, are possible. It could be that staying in the, in the institution may be a way to help restore some sanity to it. I obviously suspect not. So, I've sort of chosen my route, trying to navigate to work that is sort of less vulnerable because it depends on sort of, real outcomes in the world that can be seen and measured, sort of like my old science passion, right? I've always craved those sort of activities as Guy Love and I have participated in, like ultra marathons, where there's no bluffing, there's no pretending. At the end of the day, you survive and make it the 50 or 100 miles, or you don't, and it depends on getting it right. And so that's sort of the type of position I've taken now. And that's the thing about reality. It's going to catch up with all of us eventually. So that's, such as it is, my remarks.